Hello, dear listener, storyteller gurus. I hope you are having a good time with my content. In this video, I have decided to continue the interesting story about the Silk Road and the way how it was formed. So, without further ado, let me continue with telling the story about it. Let's go. Episode 2, Caravans of Force. The Caravans of Fortune and Faith. Zhang Jian opened the door, but it was the Sultans who walked through it. This is the story of the merchants who built the Silk Road's first golden age, and the monks who transformed it into a highway of faith. In the centuries after Shang-Qian's journey, the roads he had mapped began to fill with travelers. But the road didn't belong to the great empires. It belonged to a people who had no empire of their own. A people scattered across the oases and cities of Central Asia, connected by language, by culture, and by an instinct for commerce that was legendary even in the ancient world. They were the Sultans. Their homeland was Sultan, a region centered on the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. It was not a unified kingdom, but a collection of oasis towns, each ruled by its own lord, each competing with its neighbors, yet bound together by a common language and a common purpose. The Sultans were the Iranian people. Their language related to Persian. Their culture shaped by centuries of contact with the empires that had passed through their land. The Persians, the Greeks under Alexander, the nomadic tribes of the steppe. They were farmers in their valleys, growing wheat and barley, raising sheep and cattle. But farming alone couldn't make them rich. What made them rich was the road. Well, interesting that the Sultans occupied the perfect place. They sat in the crossroads of Asia. To their east lay to their east were the passes leading to China. To their west were Persia and the Mediterranean. To their south was India. Every trade route that crossed the continent passed through the as important than the control of trade. They did not build armies to conquer their neighbors. They built caravans to conquer the markets. A Sogdian merchant in the 4th century would begin his career young, often as a teenager, traveling with an uncle or a family friend on his first caravan journey. He would learn the languages of the road. He is native Sogdian, of course, but also Persian, Chinese, the dialects of the nomadic tribes, and the trading pidgin that developed along the roads. He would learn the distances between watering holes, the passes that remained open in the winter, the rulers who demanded bribes, and those who could be trusted. He would learn the value of silk in Samarkand versus the value in Jangan, the price of jade in Khotan, the market for musk in Persia, and when he had learned enough, he would strike out on his own, joining the networks of Sogdian merchants that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea. The Sogdians didn't travel alone. A single merchant with a few bolts of silk was a target for bandits. They traveled in caravans, sometimes hundreds of men and animals strong, organized with military discipline. At the head rode the caravan leader, the Sartpa, responsible for navigation, negotiation, and, of course, the decision-making. Behind him came the merchants themselves, each with his own goods, his own servants, his own ambition. Then came the animals, camels for the deserts, horses and donkeys for the mountains, loaded with bales of silk, bags of spices, ingots of metal. At the rear end of the caravan rode the guards, hired warriors from the nomadic tribes, their bows ready for the bandits who haunted the passes. A journey from Samarkand to Jangan took 6 months in a good weather. A year if the passes were closed, or the rulers along the way demanded protracted negotiations. The caravan moved at the pace of the slowest animal, perhaps 20 miles a day, on an open steppe, less in the mountains. It stopped at the caravanserai. What is that? Caravanserai. That is first time I hear, but never mind. The inns built a day's journey apart along the main roads where the merchants could find water, food, shelter, and the company of other travelers from dozen lands. The Saujans were not merely traders, they were also bearers of culture, the transmitters of ideas, the connectors of worlds. They carried not only silk, but also the news of distant lands, the rumors of wars and successions, the gossip of courts and bazaars. They carried recipes and musical instruments, styles of dresses and techniques of craft. They carried the stories, the myths, and the gods, and because they traveled everywhere, they were trusted nowhere. The Chinese called them Alua, a vague term for foreigners from the West, and regarded them with a mixture of suspicion and admiration. Way to go, Chinese. Well, the Chinese admired their wealth and their skills, also their exotic goods and their exotic dances. Who's not gonna admire the exotic dances? But they never, ever fully trusted them. The Saujans were guests in every land, citizens of none. Yet they thrived. By the 4th century, Saujan merchant communities had established themselves in every major city along the Silk Road. In Dunhuang, at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, they had their own quarter with their own temples and their own laws. In Chang'an, the capital of China, they dominated the trade in luxury goods. In Samarkand, their homeland, they built palaces adorned with magnificent murals, showing scenes of trade, of feasting, of worship. One Sogdian merchant, whose name we know from a cache of letters discovered in a watchtower near Dunhuang, was named Nanai Mandak. His name meant servant of goddess Nanai, and he was a typical Sogdian businessman of the 4th century. Around 313 CE, he wrote a series of letters to his partners in Samarkand, letters that were never sent, and they remained buried in the desert sand for 16 centuries, until their discovery by the archaeologist Orlstein in 1900. choices were unstable, yet through it all, Nana continued to trade, continued to send his reports, continued to hope for better times. Believe me, everyone is hoping for the better times. His letters gave us a glimpse into the life of the silkroad merchants, the risks, the frustrations, the endless calculation of profit and loss, and the stubborn determination that kept the caravans moving year after year. The Sogdians were not the only merchants on the road. There were Bactrians from Afghanistan, Parthians from Persia, Indians from the Punjab, and later Jews from Mesopotamia, and Armenians from the Caucasus. But the Sogdians were the most successful, the most widespread, the most essential for half a millennia. From the 4th century to the 8th, the Silk Road was in large part a Sogdian enterprise. Yet the Sogdians carried more than goods. They carried gods. In the 6th century BCE, in a small kingdom at the foot of the Himalayas, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama abandoned his palace, his wife, and his child to seek enlightenment. After years of asceticism and meditation, he achieved his goal and became the Buddha, the awakened one. For the remaining 45 years of his life, he walked the roads of northern India, teaching a path to liberation from suffering. For centuries after his death, Buddhism remained confined to India. The Buddha's teachings were passed down orally, memorized by monks, and eventually written down in the Pali language. The religion spread slowly across the subcontinent, but it did not cross the mountains. Into Central Asia. That changed in the 3rd century BCE when the Maurya Emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism and began sending missionaries to the neighboring lands. Ashoka's edicts, carved on rocks and pillars throughout his empire, proclaimed his support for the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching. He sent missions to Sri Lanka, to Southeast Asia, and to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West. Some of these missions may have reached Central Asia, but if they did, they left little to no trace. The real transmission of Buddhism to the north and to the east came through trade. By the 1st century CE, the Kushan Empire dynasty of Nomadic origin that had conquered Bactria and northern India was fostering a flourishing Buddhist culture. The Kushans controlled the heart of the Silk Road from the Oxus River to the Ganges. Their cities, such as Purusharapura, modern Peshawar, and Mathura, were centers of Buddhist learning and art. It was under the Kushans that the first images of Buddha were created, blending Indian and Greek artistic traditions in a style known as Gandharan art. From Kushans territory, Buddhist monks began traveling the trade routes eastward, following the caravans of Seljuk merchants into the Tarim Basin and beyond. They carried with them not only the Buddha's teachings, but also sacred texts written on palm leaves or birch bark, relics of the Buddha enshrined in small portable stupas, and the artistic traditions of Gandhara. The Tarim Basin, that vast depression between the Tian Shan and Kunlun mountains, was the first region outside India to embrace Buddhism. Its oasis kingdoms, Khotan, Kucha, Kashgar, and Durban, they became way stations for the transmission of the faith. In these cities, monks from India and Central Asia established monasteries, translated texts, and preached to the local population. The rulers of these kingdoms, eager to connect themselves to the prestige of Indian civilization, patronized Buddhism lavishly. Khotan, in the southern Tarim Basin, was particularly important. According to local legend, the Buddhism was introduced there during the reign of Ashoka, though the historical evidence points to a later date, probably the 1st or 2nd century CE. By the 3rd century, Khotan was a major Buddhist center, with hundreds of monasteries and thousands of monks. Its artists produced magnificent Buddhist paintings and sculptures, blending Indian, Iranian, and Chinese influences. From the Tarim Basin, Buddhist entered China. The traditional date for the introduction of the Buddhism to China is 67 CE, during the reign of Emperor Ming of the Eastern Han. According to the story, the emperor had a dream still considered the first Buddhist temple in China. The story is almost certainly legendary, but it reflects a historical reality. By the 1st century CE, Buddhism was known in China, probably through the merchants and envoys who traveled the Silk Road. The first documented translations of Buddhist text into Chinese were made in the 2nd century CE by a remarkable group of foreign monks, and Shigao, a Parthian prince who renounced his throne to become a monk, arrived in Luoyang in 148 CE and spent more than 20 years translating Buddhist scriptures. He focused on the basic teachings of Buddhism, texts on meditation and doctrine that appealed to Chinese intellectuals familiar with Taoist philosophy. A few years later, a Goshen monk named Lokaksima arrived in Luoyang and began translating a different type of Buddhist text. Lokaksima was the first to introduce Mahayana Buddhism to China. The Great Vehicle tradition that emphasized the Bodhisattva path, the ideal of the enlightened being who postpones his own nirvana to help all sentient beings. Lokaksima's translations included some of the most important Mahayana scriptures, including the Perfection of Wisdom sutras that would later become central to Chinese Buddhism. These early translators faced enormous challenges. Buddhist concepts had no exact equivalents in Chinese. The translators had to invent new terminology, borrowing words from the Taoism, coining new compounds, and sometimes simply transliterating Sanskrit terms. The results were often awkward and confusing, but they laid the foundation for all subsequent Buddhist translations in China. The translators were not only from India and Central Asia. Some were Parthian, like Anshigao. Some were Sogdian, like Kansengui, who was born in what is now Vietnam to a Sogdian merchant family and became one of the most influential Buddhist teachers in southern China. Some were Kuchian, like the great Kumarajiva, who transformed Chinese Buddhism in the 4th and 5th centuries. Buddhism spread slowly in China at first. It was seen as a foreign religion, practiced by foreign merchants and a few curious Chinese. But in the chaos that followed the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE, as China Buddhism found fertile ground. The old certainties of Confucian society had collapsed. The Confucian classics, with their emphasis on social harmony and filial piety, seemed irrelevant in a world of violence and uncertainty. Many Chinese turned to Taoism, seeking refuge in meditation and alchemy. Others turned to Buddhism, which offered a path to salvation that transcended the miseries of this world. Buddhism also offered something else: magic. The early Buddhist monks who came to China were not only scholars, but also wonder workers. They healed the sick, predicted the future, performed miracles. Photo Deng, a Central Asian monk who arrived in China in the early 4th century, became the trusted advisor of a barbarian warlord by demonstrating his magical powers. He could make water pour from a bowl. Nice to read. Cause lotus flowers to bloom in flames. Wow. And predict the outcome of battles. His magic won converts where philosophy couldn't. By the 4th century, Buddhism was firmly established in China. Monasteries dotted the landscape. Monks and nuns, both Chinese and foreign, practiced the Dharma. The ruling classes, both Chinese and barbarian, patronized the religion. The silkroad had become a highway of faith. While Buddhism was spreading eastward from India, another religion was traveling in the same route from the opposite direction. This was the religion of the subjects themselves. The faith they carried with them wherever they went. The subjects were Zoroastrians, or rather, they practiced a form of the ancient Iranian religion that scholars call Mazdaism, after the supreme god Ahura Mazda. This was the religion of the Persian empires, the faith of Cyrus and Darius, though the Sogdian version had its own distinctive characteristics. Mazdaism was a dualistic faith. It taught that the world was a battleground between two cosmic forces. Wow. Truth and falsehood, light and darkness, order and chaos. On one side stood Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, creator of all that is good. On the other side stood Angram, Mania, the destructive spirit, source of all evil and suffering. Human beings were caught in the middle, forced to choose sides, their choices determining their fate. son of Ahura Mazda, the visible manifestation of truth and purity. Zoroastrian temples housed sacred fires, who kept burning continuously, tended by priests who wore veils over their mouths to prevent their breath from polluting the flames. Well, the fire was never allowed to go out. It was fed with sandalwood and frankincense, the flames rising towards the sky. Death was also central. In Mazdaism, the dead body was considered supremely impure, a vessel for the forces of corruption. To bury a body was to pollute the earth. To cremate, it was to pollute the fire. Instead, the Zoroastrians exposed their dead on structures called towers of silence, where vultures and other scavengers stripped the flesh from the bones. The cleaned bones were then placed in ossuaries, the clay containers called astodons, and deposited in tombs. The Sogdians carried these practices with them across Asia. Wherever they settled, they built their fire temples, performed their rituals, and disposed of their dead accordingly to their ancient customs. In the Chinese cities where Sogdian communities flourished, archaeologists have found ossuaries and the remains of Zoroastrian shrines. The Sogdians were not dogmatic about their religion. They were practical people, and they understood that different lands had different gods. In their homeland, they worshipped Ahura Mazda and the other deities of the Iranian pantheon. But in India, they might make offerings at Buddhist shrines. In China, they might participate in Taoist ceremonies. They were willing to honor local gods, as long as their own gods were also honored. One goddess was particularly important to the Sogdians, Nanai, or Nana. She was originally a Mesopotamian deity, worshipped in Babylon and Assyria, who had spread across the Iranian world over centuries. By the time of the Sogdians, Nanai had become a complex figure, absorbing attributes from many cultures. She was depicted as the beautiful young woman, seated on a lion, holding the sun and the moon in her arms, sometimes with 4 arms, like a Hindu goddess. She was the protector of merchants, a bringer of wealth, and guardian of cities. Nani Pandak, a Sogdian merchant, whose letters were found near Dunuang, was named after this goddess. His name meant servant of Nanai, and he carried her protection with him on his journeys. The Sogdians also encountered other religions in their travel, thought a synthesis of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist ideas. The Sogdians were not converters. They did not seek to impose their religion on others, but they were transmitters, which is even better. They carried Manichaean texts from Persia to China. They carried Buddhist texts from India to Central Asia. They carried Christian ideas from Syria to the steppe. The religious landscape of the Silk Road was a mosaic, each community practicing its own faith, interacting with its neighbors, borrowing and adapting as circumstances required. The Sogdians were at the center of this mosaic, connecting the pieces, holding them together. By the 6th century, the Silk Road has entered its first golden age. The great empires of the period, the Sui and Tang in China, the Sasanian Empire in Persia, the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean, all benefited from the trade that flowed through Central Asia. And at the center of this trade still were the Sogdians. The Sogdians had established a network of merchants, colonies that stretched from Persia to Korea. In every major city along the Silk Road, there was a Sogdian quarter with its own caravanserai, with its own temple, with its own community leaders. These leaders held the title of Sabal, a Sogdian word meaning caravan leader. That became an official position in the Chinese bureaucracy. The Sabal was responsible for the Sogdian community in its city, representing them to the Chinese authorities, settling disputes among them, and maintaining their religious institutions. The Sogdians traveled, traded in everything. They brought silk from China to Persia, and glass from Persia to China. They brought musk from Tibet, jade from Khotan, spices from India, furs from Siberia. They brought horses from the Fergana Valley, the descendants of the heavenly horses that had so impressed Zhangjian centuries before. They brought gold and silver, worked into magnificent vessels by Sogdian and Persian craftsmen. They brought slaves, captured in the endless wars of the steppe and sold in the markets of Samarkand and Chang'an. But the Sogdians traded in more than goods. They traded in culture. The Sogdians were the great intermediaries of the Silk Road. They took Indian Buddhism and translated it into a form that Chinese could understand. They took Persian music and introduced introduced it to the Chinese courts. They took Chinese silk and adapted it to the Persian tastes. They took Greek medicine and passed it to India. They were the translators, the interpreters, the cultural brokers who made the silkroad work. In some accounts, they their greatest city. The Sogdians built magnificent palaces, decorated with murals that depicted their world. One mural discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of a palace at Afrasiab shows a procession of foreign envoys coming to pay homage to the Sogdian king. Chinese ambassadors in silk robes stand beside Turkish chieftains in furs and felt. Korean emissaries in distinctive hats mingle with Indians and Dhotis. The mural, painted at 7th century, captures the cosmopolitan world of the Sogdians, a world where people from a dozen lands met, traded, and negotiated. In China, the Sogdians became famous for their dancing. The Wushuan or Sogdian whirl was a spinning dance performed by Sogdian girls that became wildly popular in the Tang Dynasty China. Poets wrote verses about it. Painters depicted it on the scrolls and murals. The dance was so popular that it even became a subject of political intrigue. Anushan, the Sogdian Turkic general whose rebellion nearly toppled the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century, was said to be the master of the world, and his performances at court won him the favor of the emperor, and some said the empress also. The Sogdians also introduced new foods to China. Grapes and wine came from Central Asia, as did alfalfa for feeding horses. The flatbreads of the Sogdians became popular in the Chinese cities. Their music, played on lutes and harps, filled the courts of the Tang aristocrats. But the Sogdians' greatest contribution to Chinese culture may have been their role in the transmission of Buddhism. Sogdian monks and merchants carried Buddhist texts from India to China, translating them along the way. Sogdian artists created Buddhist art that blended Indian, Persian, and Chinese styles. Sogdian communities provided the infrastructure that supported Buddhist pilgrims traveling between China and India. One such pilgrim was Xuanzang. Sorry for mispronouncing that, but I think it's called Xuanzang. The most famous Buddhist traveler in Chinese history. In 629 CE, Xuanzang left Shanghai on a 16-year journey to India, seeking Buddhist scriptures that passing the Sogdian cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, crossing the passes of the Pamirs, and descending into India. Everywhere he went, he found Sogdian merchants and monks who helped him on his way. When Xuanzang returned to China in 645, he brought back hundreds of Buddhist texts and detailed account of his journey. His great Tang records on the western regions became a classic of travel literature and crucial source of understanding the Silk Road in the 7th century. In it, he described the Sogdian cities he had visited, their wealth, their customs, and their religions. By the time of Xuanzang's journey, the Sogdians had reached the height of their power and influence. Their network stretched across Asia. Their caravans moved without interruption from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea. Their merchants were trusted, their goods coveted, and their culture admired. But already changes were coming. To the west, a new power was rising, a power that would sweep across Asia and transform the Silk Road forever. The Arabs, united by the new religion of Islam, were beginning their conquest of Persia and Central Asia. Within a century, the Sogdian homeland would be under Muslim rule, and the Sogdians themselves would gradually convert to Islam, abandoning their ancient gods. To the east, the Tang dynasty was entering its own period of transformation. The cosmopolitan openness of the early Tang would give way to suspicion of foreigners and their foreign religions. The Andalusian rebellion, led by that Sogdian Turkish general who had charmed the court with his dancing, would devastate China and shatter the trade networks that the Sogdians had built. The Sogdian merchants would not disappear overnight. Their communities would persist in China for centuries, gradually assimilating into the local population. Their language would survive in the documentation dangerous for centuries more, until the day when the caravans finally stopped and the desert sands reclaimed their secrets. This is the end of episode 2. Thank you guys for listening to my content. I would encourage you to motivate me with a like and subscribe. Stay with my channel for future videos. Bye. Hello dear listener. In this video I'm going to present you episode 3 of my silkroad story, which is called The Age of Empires and Exchange. For a brief moment in history, the greatest empires of East and West stood face to face. They met not on the battlefield, but on the road. This is a story of how Silk Road became the superhighway of ideas, technology, and culture, and how a single battle changed everything. In the 8th century, there was no place on earth like Chang'an. The capital of the Tang dynasty stood at the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, a city of more than 1 million people enclosed within walls that stretched for 20 miles. It was the largest city in the world, larger than Baghdad, larger than Constantinople, larger than anything Europe has had seen since the fall of Rome. And it was by design a city that welcomed the world. Emperor Taizong, which ruled from 626 to 649, had laid the foundations. He was a man of military genius who had helped found the dynasty and then seized power for himself. But he was also a man of remarkable openness. He looked at the wars that had torn China apart for centuries and concluded that the key to lasting peace was not isolation, but engagement. He welcomed envoys from distant lands. He tolerated foreign religions. He encouraged trade. By the time of the emperor Xuanzong, is it Xuanzong? I don't know. Sorry. Who ruled from 720 to 756. Chang'an had become the cosmopolitan heart of Asia. The city was laid on a grade with broad avenues running north, south, and east-west, dividing the city into old wards. The imperial palace occupied the northern end, facing south towards the city. The traditional orientation of Chinese rulers, the main thoroughfare, the Vermilion Bird Avenue, was 500 feet wide. What? A processional way that led from the palace to the southern gates. But it was the western market that drew the crowds. The western market was the great emporium of where the silkroad poured its riches into China. Here, merchants from every corner of Asia set up their stalls and conducted their business. Soldiers from Samarkand sold jade and amber, their distinctive bearded faces and colorful coats, marking them as foreigners. Persians offered parlor rest. Their Zoroastrian fine art temples hidden away in the foreign quarter. Indians traded in spices and ivory. Their Buddhist monks walking the streets in saffron robes. Uyghurs from the steppe brought horses and birds, their faces tattooed with the marks of their tribes. Even an occasional Frank or Syrian might appear, having traveled the entire length of Asia just to reach this fabled city. The market dealt in everything. Silk, of course, was the foundation of the trade boats of the finest fabric woven into the imperial workshops or produced by peasant families in the countryside, destined for the courts of Persia and Constantinople. But there was also tea, which was just becoming popular in China and would one day conquer the world. There was porcelain, so fine and translucent that it was called China wherever it went. There was paper, a Chinese invention that was only beginning to spread westward. And there were things that had no business being in China at all. Nice Persian silverwork, engraved with scenes of royal hunts and Zoroastrian priests. Indian cotton, dyed in colors that never faded. Greek glass, so clear that it seemed like frozen water. African ivory, carved into figurines by craftsmen who had never seen an elephant. The Western market wasn't just a place of commerce, it was a place of encounter. Here, a Chinese poet might debate the nature of reality with a Buddhist monk from India. A Persian astronomer might share his knowledge of stars with a Taoist alchemist. A Turkish horseman might teach a Chinese soldier the tricks of steppe warfare. The market was a university without walls, a place where the world came to learn. Emperor Xuanzang encouraged all of this. He was a patron of the arts, a poet himself, a lover of music and dance. His court was filled with foreign musicians, foreign dancers, foreign entertainers. Central Asian girls performed the Seljuk whirl at palace banquets. Indian jugglers amazed the court with their tricks. Persian chefs introduced new dishes to the imperial kitchen. But Xuanzang's greatest passion was for the horses of Fergana, the descendants of the heavenly horses that Shangqian had magnificent animals, their coats gleaming, their manes flowing. He commissioned paintings of them, poems about them, sculptures in their honor. He believed that Chinese emperors had believed for centuries that these horses were the key to military power, the only way to match the mounted warriors of the steppe. The horses came west along the Silk Road, driven by Sogdian merchants, traded for the Chinese silk, and with them came the people who knew how to take care of them. Persian grooms, Turkish trainers, Sogdian veterinarians. The horses were not just animals, they were ambassadors of the peace, I guess, bringing with them the knowledge and skills of distant lands. Shangan was the heart of the Tang Empire, but the empire stretched far beyond the city's walls. To the west, along the Silk Road, the Tang had established protectorates and garrisons, extending Chinese power deep into Central Asia. The four garrisons of Anshikucha, Kashgar, Khotan, and Karashar were Chinese outposts in the Tarim Basin, controlling the trade routes and protecting the caravans. Chinese officials administered these cities. Chinese soldiers manned their walls, and Chinese merchants did business in their markets. But the Tang were not the only power in Asia. To the west, another empire was rising, an empire that was soon challenge China for control of the Silk Road. In 1632 CE, a man died in Medina. His name was Muhammad, and he was the prophet of Islam. Within a century of his death, his followers had conquered an empire that stretched from Spain to India, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Oxus River. Where is that? I have to search it. The Arab armies, inspired by faith and driven by ambition, had swept away the Sasanian Empire of Persia and stripped the Byzantine Empire of its richest provinces. By 750, when a new dynasty called the Abbasids seized power, the Islamic world was the largest empire the world had ever seen, and its capital, Baghdad, was becoming a worthy rival to Shangan. The Abbasid caliphs were not Arabs by origin. They came from Persia, and they brought Persian traditions of kingship and administrations to the Islamic State. The second Abbasid caliph, Al-Mansur, chose the site ancient Persian capital of Ctesiphon, at the crossroads of trade routes from Persia, Syria, and Arabia. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. But everyone knew it as Baghdad. Baghdad was built on a circular plan, with the Caliph's palace at the center, and the markets and residential quarters arrayed in rings around it. It was a city designed for control, for security, for the display of power. But it was also a city designed for commerce. The markets of Baghdad rivaled those in Shanghai. Here, merchants from every corner of the Islamic world gathered to trade. Here, merchants from every corner of the Islamic world gathered to trade. From India came spices, textiles, and precious stones. From Central Asia came furs, slaves, and the famous horses of Fargana. From East Africa came ivory and gold. From Scandinavia came amber and furs, brought by the Viking traders who traveled down the Russian rivers to the Caspian Sea. And from China came silk, porcelain, and paper. The paper was particularly important. The secret of paper making had been known in China for centuries, but it had remained a Chinese monopoly. That changed in 751 at a place called the Talas River. The Abbasid caliphs, like the Tang emperors, were patrons of learning. The second Abbasid caliph, Al-Mansur, had gathered scholars from across his empire to translate the works of Greek philosophy, Persian history, and Indian mathematics into Arabic. His successors continued this tradition, establishing a great library and translation center in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom. At this particular House of Wisdom, scholars of all faiths and backgrounds worked side by side. Christians translated Greek medical texts, Jews translated Hebrew scriptures, Zoroastrians translated Persian chronicles, Muslims coordinated the whole enterprise, synthesizing the knowledge of the ancient world and adding their own discoveries. The greatest of these scholars was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a Persian mathematician who worked at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century. Al-Khwarizmi wrote a book on algebra, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wa Muqabala. Sorry if somebody knows Arabic. I don't know. concept of solving equations systematically. The word algebra comes from the algebra in his title. He also wrote a book on astronomy and a book of geography that synthesized Greek and Indian knowledge with Islamic observations. Another great scholar was Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, a philosopher and scientist who wrote hundreds of books on topics ranging from optics to music theory. Al-Kindi argued that Greek philosophy and Islamic revelation were compatible, that reason and faith could coexist. His work laid the foundation for the great flowering of Islamic philosophy in later centuries. The scholars of Baghdad did not merely preserve ancient knowledge, they advanced it. They improved on Greek astronomy, developing more accurate models of planetary motion. They built on Indian mathematics, inventing new methods of calculation. They conducted experiments in chemistry and physics, laying the foundation for the scientific method. And they did it all in a city that was like Chang'an, a crossroads of the world. The scholars of Baghdad could consult manuscripts from Greece, Persia, India, and China. They could debate with travelers from every corner of Asia. They could draw on the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had never before been brought together. But Baghdad was not the only center of Islamic learning. Across the empire, from Cordoba in Spain to Samarkand in Central Asia, cities competed to attract scholars and patrons. The Silk Road carried not only goods but also ideas, and those ideas found a fertile home in the Islamic world. The 8th and 9th centuries were the golden age of the Silk Road, a time when the great empires of Asia were at peace with one another, and trade flowed freely from one end of the continent to the other. The Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, and the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean formed a triangle of civilization, each connected to others by the threads of the Silk Road. Travelers moved along these threads in both directions, carrying not only goods but also knowledge. From China came the great inventions that would transform the world. Paper, which had been invented in China in the 1st century CE, has spread westward along the Silk Road, reaching Samarkand in the 8th century and Baghdad in the century, paper mills were operating in Egypt, and by the 12th century, in Europe, paper made possible the spread of knowledge, the keeping of records, the administration of empires. Gunpowder, another Chinese invention, followed the same route. The Chinese had discovered that mixing saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal produced an explosive substance. They used it for fireworks and later for weapons. The knowledge spread slowly westward, reaching the Islamic world by the 13th century, and Europe by the 14th. Gunpowder would revolutionize warfare and eventually help Europe conquer the world. The compass, too, came from China. Chinese sailors have been using magnetic needles to navigate since the 11th century. Knowledge spread along the Silk Road, reaching the Indian Ocean and eventually the Mediterranean. The compass made possible the age of exploration. The voyages of Columbus and Magellan, the globalization of the world. Printing was another Chinese gift to the world. The Chinese had been printing with wood blocks since the 7th century, and they invented movable type in the 11th century. The technology spread slowly westward, reaching Europe by the 15th century, where Gutenberg printing press would transform society. From the Islamic world came other gifts: mathematics, including algebra, and the Indian numerals that we call Arabic numerals, spread eastward along the Silk Road, reaching China by the 13th century. Astronomy, with its accurate tables and sophisticated instruments, was eagerly studied by Chinese scholars. Medicine, based on the works of Galen, who's that, and the discoveries of the Islamic physicians, was translated and absorbed. From India came Buddhism, which had been spreading along the Silk Road for centuries, and now reaching its fullest development in China. From Persia came administrative techniques and courtly culture, both adopted. From Persia came administrative techniques and courtly culture, adopted by both the Abbasids and the Tang. From the steppe came military technology, the horsemanship and archery that made nomadic armies so formidable. The Silk Road wasn't just a road, it was a conversation. And in the 8th and 9th century, that conversation reached its peak. One of the most remarkable travelers of this period was a man named Du Huan. Du Huan was a Chinese soldier who was captured at the Battle of Talas in 751 and spent the next 10 years traveling through the Islamic world. He visited Samarkand and Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. He celebrated cities of the Abbasid Empire and the Islamic world. When he finally returned to China, he wrote a book about his travels, describing the customs, religions, and technologies he had encountered. Duhuan's book hasn't survived, but the fragments of it were quoted in other works. Describe the Christians he met in Syria, with their monasteries and their saints. He described the Zoroastrians in Persia, with their fire temples and their exposure of the dead. He described the Muslims with their prayers, their pilgrimages. He described the foods, the clothes, the buildings, the cities. Duhuan was not the only traveler. Buddhist monks continued to make the journey from China to India, seeking scriptures and visiting holy sites. Muslim merchants traveled to China, settling in the port cities of the south and the capital of Shanghai. Nestorian Christians, followed by a branch of Christianity condemned as heretical in Byzantium, established communities along the Silk Road, and even sent missionaries to China. In 781, a remarkable monument was erected in Shanghai. It was a stone pillar, inscribed in Chinese and Syriac, describing the history of the Nestorian mission to China. The stele, now known as the Nestorian stele, recorded that the first Nestorian missionaries had arrived in China in 635 during the reign of the Emperor Taizong. They had been welcomed, given permissions to preach, and provided with a monastery. For the next century and a half, the Nestorian community in China flourished, supported by the Tang emperors and patronized by the Chinese converts. The stele was buried during the persecution of foreigners that followed the Andalusian Rebellion, and was not rediscovered until the 17th century, but it stands as a testament to the religious diversity of Tang China, a world where Buddhists and Taoists, Muslims and Nestorians, Zoroastrians and Manichaeans could all practice their faiths under the protection of the emperor. On a summer day in 751, two armies faced each other on the banks of the Talas River in what is now Kyrgyzstan. On one side stood the forces of the Tang dynasty, led by the Korean general Gao Shangji. On the other side stood the forces of the Abbasid Caliphate, led by the Arab general Ziyad ibn Salih. The battle was the climax of a long rivalry. For decades, the Tang and the Abbasids had competed for influence in Central Asia, each trying to win the allegiance of the local rulers, each trying to control the trade routes. The Tang had established their protectorates in the Taran Basin and were pushing westward. The Abbasids had conquered Persia and were pushing eastward. Chinese were disciplined, well-armed, and experienced. Their infantry carried crossbows. Their cavalry was mounted on the heavenly horses of Morgana. They had defeated every enemy they had faced in Central Asia. But the Abbasids had allies. The Karluks, a Turkish tribe that had been fighting for the Tang, suddenly switched sides in the middle of the battle. The Chinese flank collapsed. Gao Xiangxi had tried to rally his men, but it was hopeless. He cut his way out of the encirclement and fled eastwards, leaving thousands of his soldiers dead on the battlefield. Among the survivors was a man whose name we did not know. He was a Chinese maker, one of the many craftsmen who had accompanied the Tang army to provide services to the soldiers. When the battle turned against the Chinese, he was captured by the Abbasids and taken to Samarkand. Samarkand was already the center of paper making. The Sogdians had learned the craft from the Chinese centuries before and had established their own workshops. But the Chinese paper maker brought new technologies, new skills, new knowledge. He was taken to Baghdad, where he taught his craft to the Abbasids. The secret of paper making, which the Chinese had guarded for centuries, was now in the hands of their rivals. Within decades, paper mills were operating throughout the Islamic world. Within centuries, paper had replaced papyrus and parchment in Europe. The Battle of Talas, a minor skirmish on a distant river, had changed the world. The battle had other consequences. The Tang never recovered their position in Central Asia. The An-Lushan Rebellion, which broke out just 4 years later, devastated China and ended the cosmopolitan golden age of the Tang. The Abbasids, despite their victory, soon lost control of Central Asia to local dynasties. The silkroad continued to function, but the great empires that had nurtured it were in decline. Yet the exchange continued, thank God. The paper maker who was captured at Talas didn't know that he was carrying the future. He only knew that he was prisoner, far from home, forced to teach his craft to strangers. But the knowledge he passed on would outlast the empires that had fought that day. It would spread across the world, transforming how humans communicate, how they learn, how they remember. The Battle of Talas is often seen as a turning point, the moment when Chinese expansion westward was halted and Islamic influence in Central Asia was confirmed. But it was also something else, a moment of transfer, when the knowledge of one civilization passed to another. The Silk Road wasn't just a road of In the middle of the 8th century, the golden age of the Silk Road was already beginning to fade out. The Tang dynasty, weakened by the Andalusian rebellion and the subsequent breakdown of the central authority, turned inward, suspicious of foreigners and their foreign ways. The Abbasid Caliphate, beset by internal conflicts and provincial revolts, had lost control of its distant territories. The road remained open, but the great empires that had made it safe were no longer watching. Yet the exchange continued. The knowledge that had flowed along the Silk Road for centuries didn't stop flowing. It simply found new channels, new carriers, new destinations. The paper that had been made in China was now being made in Baghdad. The algebra that had been developed in Baghdad would one day reach Europe. The compass that had guided Chinese ships would guide Portuguese explorers around Africa. The empires that had built the Silk Road passed into history, but the road itself endured, waiting for the next great power to take up the task of keeping it open. This is the end of episode 3. If you made it until this far, thank you for listening to my content and I appreciate every single view. I love you so much. See you in the next video. Bye. Hello, dear listener. In this episode 4, we will learn about the Mongols and the Mongol peace. From the steppes of Mongolia, a storm was brewing. The Mongols rode out of nothingness to conquer the largest empire in history, and in doing so, they accidentally created the Silk Road's final golden age. This is the story of how barbarians became the greatest facilitators of trade the world has ever seen. The steppe is a sea of grass that stretches from the forest of Siberia to the Great Wall of China to the mountains of Altai and to the plains of Hungary. For thousands of years, it had been a home to nomadic people who lived on horseback, followed their herds, and raided the settled civilization on its borders. The Scythians, the Shawno, the Turks, all had risen from the steppe. the steppe, surviving on the roots and rodents, hunted by rivals who wanted to eliminate any potential threats. Temujin grew up in this world of violence and betrayal. He learned to trust no one, to strike first, and to never forget an enemy. He also learned to forge alliances, to bind men with loyalty, to bind men to him with loyalty rather than fear, to reward those who served him well. These lessons would serve him for the rest of his life. As a young man, Temujin began gathering followers. He attracted warriors with his reputation for fairness and his willingness to share the spoils of victory. He defeated rival tribes one by one, absorbing their warriors into his own forces, executing their leaders, and offering their people a choice: join him or die. In 1206, Temujin achieved what no one else had achieved before. He united all the tribes of the Mongolian steppe under his rule. At a great assembly called the Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Genghis Khan's rise had been brutal. He had wiped out entire tribes that opposed him. He had executed rival chieftains and scattered their own people among his own followers. He had imposed a strict legal code, the Yasa, that governed every aspect of Mongol life. But he had also created something new: a nation united under a single leader, bound by a single purpose. That purpose was conquest. The Mongols were the greatest warriors the world has ever seen. They were raised on horseback, learning to ride before they could walk. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy at a full gallop, turning the saddle to fire behind them. They could ride for days without stopping, sleeping in the saddle, drinking their horse's blood when water ran short. What? Their composite bows, made of wood, horn, and sinew, that penetrate armor at 200 yards. Their tactics, honed by generations of steppe warfare, were flexible, adaptive, legions of 10,000. He promoted based on merit, not birth. He created an elite imperial guard, the Keshik, that served as both his personal bodyguard and a training ground for future commanders. He established a system of messengers and relay stations, the YAM, that allowed communication across his growing empire. In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention to China. The Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China, had long demanded tribute from the steppe tribes. Now the Mongols came to collect their own tribute. The Jin armies were larger and better equipped than the Mongols, but they were slow and rigid. The Mongols had outmaneuvered them, avoided their main forces, and struck at their supply lines. Within 4 years, the Mongols had taken the Jin capital Shantou, modern Beijing. The Jin emperor fled south, and the northern China was under the Mongol control. But Genghis Khan's ambitions extended far beyond China. To the west lay the empire of Khwarezm Shah, a powerful Muslim state that controlled Persia and Central Asia. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade mission to Khwarezm Shah. Seeking to establish diplomatic and commercial relations. The governor of the border city of Otrar, either out of greed or suspicion, seized the caravan and executed the merchants. Genghis Khan sent an embassy to demand compensation. The Khwarezm Shah, perhaps underestimating the threat, executed the ambassadors as well. It was the worst mistake he could have ever made. Genghis Khan was not a man who forgave insults. He gathered his army and rode west. In 1219, he crossed the Oxus River into Khwarezmian territory with perhaps 200,000 men. The largest Mongol army ever assembled. The campaign that followed was one of the most brutal in history. City after city fell to the Mongols. Those who surrendered were spared, though they were forced to provide troops and supplies. Those that resisted were annihilated. At Bukhara, the Mongols hardened the surrounding defenders into the main mosque and executed them. At Samarkand, they slaughtered thousands and carried off the artisans and craftsmen to Mongolia. At Urgench, they diverted the river and flooded the city. Then executed every inhabitant. The Khwarezm Shah fled, pursued by the Mongol generals, who would not stop until they had driven him to an island in the Caspian Sea. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in 1225. He died 2 years later in 1227 during a campaign against the Tanguts in western China. His body was returned to his homeland and buried in a secret location that has never been found. At his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It was the largest contiguous empire in history, larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, larger than Alexander's conquests, larger than anything the world has ever seen. And it was still growing. Genghis Khan's empire was too large for any one man to rule. Genghis Khan's empire was too large for any one man to rule. He divided it among his 4 sons by his chief wife, Borte, with the understanding that one of them would be recognized as a great Khan, the supreme ruler of all Mongols. The succession was not smooth. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons fought amongst themselves, sometimes bitterly, but they also continued the work of conquest. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its greatest extent. In the east, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai completed the conquest of China. He defeated the southern Song, the last Chinese dynasty, and established a new dynasty of his own, the Yuan. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by a foreigner. In the west, another grandson, Hulagu, swept through Persia and Mesopotamia. In 1258, he captured Baghdad, the capital of Abbasid Caliphate. The last caliph was executed, rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses, to avoid spilling royal blood. What? Baghdad, the greatest city of the Islamic world, was sacked and burned. The House of Wisdom, with its centuries of accumulated knowledge, was destroyed. The Tigris ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of scholars. Only the Mamluks of Egypt, who defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, stopped the Mongol advance in the Middle East. And in the north, the Golden Horde, the Mongol state established by the Genghis Khan's eldest son, Joki, ruled the Russian principalities, extracting tribute and demanding obedience. The Mongol Empire was not a single unified state. By the 1260s, it had fractured into the 4 main Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Steppe, and the Chagatai Khanate settled people they conquered. They did not care about religion or culture or ethnicity. They cared about loyalty, about obedience, about tribute. They were practical people, and they understood that ruling a vast empire required more than just conquest. It required administration, communication, and all above, trade. The Mongols had no experience with trade. They were nomads, herders, warriors, but they understood the value of goods. And they understood that the merchants who traveled the Silk Road could bring them things they wanted: silk, gold, weapons, luxury, goods from distant lands. They also understood that the merchants can serve as spies, gathering intelligence about the countries they visited. So the Mongols did something unprecedented. They actively encouraged trade. Genghis Khan had established a yam, a system of relay stations that stretched across the empire. Riders could travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks, carrying messages, news, intelligence. The yam was originally a military and administrative system, but it also benefited the merchants. The stations provided food, water, fresh horses, and shelter. A merchant with the proper documents could travel in safety and comfort that would have been unimaginable before the Mongols. More importantly, the Mongols imposed peace. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was enforced by the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen. Bandits were hunted down and executed. Local rulers who attacked caravans were punished severely. The roads were safe for the first time in centuries. The results were dramatic. Wow! Trade along the Silk Road boomed. Caravans that had once traveled in fear of bandits and hostile rulers now moved freely across the entire continent. Goods that had been rare and expensive became common and affordable. Ideas that had been confined to one region spread to others. The Mongols themselves were transformed by the trade they encouraged. They adopted the religions of their subjects: Tibetan Buddhism in China, Islam in Persia, Nestorian Christianity among some tribes. They adopted the customs and technologies of the settled people. They built the cities, patronized the arts, and sponsored scholarships. Kublai Khan, the greatest of the Mongol emperors, was as much as a Chinese emperor as Mongol Khan, ruling from his capital in Ganbalik, modern Beijing, in a palace that amazed all who saw it. But the Mongols remained Mongols. They kept their own laws, their own customs. father and uncle Niccolo and Maffeo had already made one journey to the east, reaching the court of Kublai Khan in 1260s. When they returned to Venice in 1269, they found that Marco's mother had died and that Marco, now 50, had been raised by relatives. In 1271, the Polos set out again. This time taking young Marco with them. They traveled overland through Persia and Central Asia, crossing the Pamir Mountains and following the silkroad into China. The journey took 3.5 years. They finally reached Kublai Khan court in 1275. Kublai Khan received them warmly. He was curious about the West, about Christianity, about European customs. He took a liking to young Marco, who was intelligent and observant, and sent him on missions throughout the empire. Marco traveled to distant provinces, reported back to the Khan, and learned the languages and customs of the many people ruled by the Mongols. The Polos stayed in China for 17 years. They grew wealthy in the Khan's service, but they also grew homesick. Finally, in 1292, they asked permission to leave. Kublai Khan was reluctant to let them go, but he agreed, entrusting them with a mission: escort the Mongol princess to Persia, where she was to marry the ill Khan. The journey home took 2 years. They traveled by sea through Southeast Asia and India, around the coast of Arabia, and finally to Persia. From there, they made their way overland to Constantinople and then to Venice. They arrived in 1295, 24 years after they had left. The Polos were not recognizable when they returned. They were dressed in ragged clothes, speaking a mixture of languages, looking more like foreigners than Venetians. They had to tear open the seams of their garments to reveal the jewels they had sewn inside, proof of their imagination of Europe, opening a window onto a world that most Europeans could barely imagine. Marco Polo wasn't the only traveler on the Silk Road. In the opposite direction from west to east came others. Rabban Barsauma was an historian, Christian monk born in Kanpalik, modern Beijing, around 1220. His parents were Turkish or Mongol. His faith was Christian, and his culture was a mixture of all the peoples of the Mongol Empire. In 1275, he and his disciple Rabban Marcos set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They traveled westward along the Silk Road through Central Asia and Persia, visiting Christian communities along the way. By the time they reached Baghdad, they had abandoned their plan to go to Jerusalem. The political situation was too unstable, and the Mongol Ilkhan Abaka was friendly to Christians. Rabban Marcos eventually was selected Patriarch of the Nestorian Church, taking the name Mar Yabala. Rabban Barsauma became his emissary, sent to Europe to seek an alliance between the Mongols and the Christian powers against the Muslims. In 1287, Rabban Barsauma arrived in Constantinople. They then sailed to Italy and France. He met with the Byzantine Emperor, the French King, and the Pope. He celebrated Mass in the great cathedrals of Europe. He was amazed by the size and wealth of the European cities, but he was also disappointed by their inability to unite against the common enemy. He returned to Persia in 1288, with his mission being a failure, but his journey a testament to the interconnectedness of the Mongol world. There were others, Franciscan friars sent by the Pope to convert the Mongols, Muslim scholars traveling between the courts of the Ilkhans and the Mamluks, Buddhist monks from Tibet visiting the Yuan court. Merchants from every corner of Eurasia plying their trade along the safe roads of the Mongol Empire. The Silk Road had never been so busy, and it had never been so safe. The Pax Mongolica didn't last forever. The Mongol Empire, always fragile, began to fracture in the late 13th century. The Ilkhans and the Golden Horde fought each other. The Chagatai Khanate descended into civil war. The Yuan dynasty in China bandits returned to the roads. The caravanserai fell into despair. And then came the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in the history of the most devastating. The Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in the human history, probably originated in the steppes of Central Asia. It was carried by fleas that lived on it. It was carried by fleas that lived on rodents, particularly marmots, which were hunted by nomads for their fur. When the nomads brought the infected fleas to trading posts in caravanserai, the plague spread. The plague spread to the merchants who traveled with the silkroad. By 1330s, the plague had reached the borders of China. By the 1340s, it has spread across Central Asia to the Black Sea. In 1347, a Genoese trading ship docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying infected sailors. Within months, the plague had swept through Italy. Within years, it had killed perhaps half the population of Europe. The plague devastated the Mongol Empire as well. The Yuan dynasty in China, already weakened by rebellion and economic crisis, was hit hard. The population declined, the economy contracted. The population declined, the economy contracted, government lost control. In 1368, a Chinese rebel leader named Xu Yuanzhang captured Kambalik and declared him emperor of a new dynasty, the Ming. The Mongols fled back to the steppe and the Chinese rule restored. And the Chinese rule was restored after a century of foreign domination. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapsed in 1330s, fragmented by succession disputes and rebellion. The Golden Horde. The Golden Horde survived longer, but it was too weakened. But it too was weakened by a plastic war, but it's too weakened by the plague and by internal conflicts. By the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire was a memory. Its successor states reduced to regional powers. The silkroad did not disappear overnight. Trade continued, but at a reduced level. The great caravans that once have traveled from China to Persia became smaller, less frequent. The merchants who had once crossed the continent now confined themselves to regional routes. The road that had connected the world for centuries was slow But the Mongols had left their mark. They had united Eurasia as it had never been united before, and as it would never be united again. They had opened the roads and made them safe. They have encouraged trade and tolerated their religions. They had encouraged trade and tolerated all religions. They had created the conditions for the greatest exchange of goods and ideas in the human history. And in doing so, they had changed the world. In 1368, when the Ming changed, captured Kanbilak, the last Mongol empire of China, fled north to steppe. His name was Tolan Timur. In the 1368, when the Ming armies captured Kanbilak, the last Mongol emperor of China fled north into the steppe. His name was Tolan Timur. And he had ruled for 35 years. The longest of any human emperor. He was a weak ruler, more interested in Buddhism and art than in governing, but he had not entirely been useful. But he was not totally to blame for the fall of his dynasty. The plague, the rebellions, all the economic crises were beyond his control. Tolan Timur died in 1317. Tolan Timur died in 1370 in exile in Mongolia. His descendants continued to live in the steppe, calling themselves Khans and raiding the Chinese border, dreaming. His descendants continued to rule themselves in the steppe, calling themselves Khans, raiding the Chinese border, dreaming of reconquest. But they never enrolled China. The Yuan dynasty was over, and with it the Mongol peace. The silkroad would have one more brief flowering under the Timurids in Central Asia, but it would never be the same. It would never be what it had been around the Mongols. The age of overland trade was ending. A new age. The age of maritime trade was about to begin. But that is another story. End of episode 4. Thank you, my dear listener, for listening to my stories. I encourage you with a like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Hello, my dear listener. In this video, I'm going to present you episode 5, which is called Shadows on the Road. 1330s, something stirred in the steppes of Central Asia. No one noticed at first. The region was vast and sparsely populated. A sea of grass stretching from the Altai Mountains to the Caspian Sea. Nomads moved their herds across it, following the seasons, living in felt tents called yurts. Merchants crossed it along the ancient roads, their caravans loaded with silk and spices, their camels swaying with the rhythm of the road. Life went on as it had for centuries, but in the burrows of the steppe, among the marmots and the gerbils, a bacterium was waiting. Yersinia pestis is an unremarkable organism under a microscope. A rod-shaped bacterium, gram-negative, nothing special to look at, but it has a remarkable life cycle. It lives in the blood of rodents, transmitted by fleas that bite the infected animal, and then pass the bacteria to the next animal they bite. Normally, this cycle continues unnoticed. The rodents and the fleas and the bacteria coexisting in an uneasy equilibrium. Sometimes, though, this equilibrium breaks. A drought, a harsh winter, an explosion in the rodent population. Something disrupts the balance. The fleas seeking new hosts. They find the nomads who hunt the marmots for their fur. They find the merchants who stop at the caravanserai where the rodents have nested. They find the travelers who carry them to the next oasis, next city, the next civilization. In 1338 and 1339, a strange thing happened in an Nestorian Christian community near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The death rate suddenly spiked. Excavations of the cemetery there, conducted by the Russian archaeologists in the 1880s, revealed tombstones with inscriptions noting that the deceased had died of pestilence. The dating is suggestive. 1338, 1339. The plague was already active in Central Asia, years before it reached Europe. From Issyk-Kul, the plague followed the roads. The Silk Road in the 1330s was a still functioning network despite the decline of the Mongol Empire. Caravans moved regularly between China and Persia, between Persia and the Black Sea. They stopped at the same caravanserai, drank from the same wells, slept in the same rooms. The fleas that carried the plague traveled with provinces. The population, which had already declined under Mongol rule, it fell further. The government, distracted by its own problems, did little to respond. The plague also spread westward across Central Asia to Persia, to Ilkhanate, the Mongol state. That had ruled Persia for a century was already collapsing when the plague arrived. The last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, had died in 1335, leaving the empire divided among rival claimants. The plague finished what the succession disputes had begun. Cities were depopulated, fields lay untended, the economy collapsed. A Persian historian, writing a few decades later, described the horror. The world was devastated from east to west, and many fled from the face of the plague. The population of the earth decreased. From Persia, the plague spread north to the lands of the Golden Horde, the Mongol state that ruled Russia and the steppe. The Golden Horde cities, strung along the Volga River and the trade routes to the Black Sea, those were vulnerable. Sarai, the capital, was hit hard. The Khan's army, campaigning in the Caucasus, was infected. The plague spread through the camps, killing soldiers and horses alike. Then it reached the Black Sea. In 1346, the plague arrived in the trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Kaffa was a Genoese colony, a fortified trading post where Italian merchants bought the goods of Asia: spices, silk, furs, slaves, and shipped them across the Black Sea to Constantinople and beyond. It was a prosperous place with warehouses full of merchandise, churches full of worshippers, and streets full of merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean. The plague didn't come to Kaffa alone. It came when an army, the Mongols of the Golden Horde, led by a Khan named Janibek, had been besieging Kaffa for years. They wanted to break the Italian monopoly on Black Sea trade, to force the Genoese to pay a higher tribute, to assert their control over the Crimean coast. The siege had dragged on, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Then the plague struck the Mongol camp. The army was devastated. Men died by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Sorry, the dens were filled with the dead and the dying. The survivors, terrified and desperate, abandoned the siege. But before they left, they did something that would become legend. According to contemporary accounts by an Italian lawyer named Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongols used catapults to hurl the bodies of their dead over the walls of Kaffa. They hoped to infect the defenders, to spread the plague inside the city, to kill their enemies even in defeat. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians. The Moses account is the only source for the story, and it was written years after the event. But even the story is exaggerated. It captures something true. The plague was coming, and nothing could stop it. The Genoese defenders of Kaffa, crowded inside the walls, with limited food and water, were already vulnerable when the plague entered the city. Whether by catapult, or by rat, or by flea, it spread rapidly. Those who could fled. They boarded ships and sailed for home, carrying the plague with them. In 1347, those ships docked at Messina, on the island of Sicily. The sailors were dying, covered by black swellings in their armpits and groins. The authorities ordered them to leave, but it was too late. The plague had already arrived in Europe. The plague that reached Europe in 1347 was unlike anything the continent had ever experienced. It killed quickly and horribly. Victims developed fever, chills and headache, followed by the characteristic swellings, bubbles in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpit, or neck. The bubbles turned black, oozed blood and pus, and grew to the size of eggs or apples. Some victims coughed up blood, a sign that the infection had reached their lungs. Most died within a week of showing symptoms. Some died within hours. The disease had three forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, was transmitted by fleas and caused the characteristic swellings. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs, was even more deadly and could be transmitted directly from person to person through coughing. A septicemic plague, which infected the blood, killed so fast that victims sometimes died before showing any symptoms at all. Medieval medicine had no answers. Doctors bled their patients, applied poultices, prescribed herbal remedies. Nothing worked. The church organized prayers and prayers. But the plague struck down priests as readily as peasants. People turned to saints, to relic, to magic. Nothing helped. The psychological impact was devastating. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who survived the plague in Florence, described the scene in the introduction of his Decameron. In the face of so much affliction and misery, all respect for the loss of God and men had virtually broken down and been extinguished in our city. For like everybody else, those ministers and executors of the law were either dead or sick, or so short of that they were unable to discharge any of their duties. As a result, everyone was free to do as they pleased. Some people fled, abandoning their families and their property. Others shut themselves in their houses, refusing to see anyone. Still others gave themselves up to pleasure, drinking and feasting and indulging every desire, convinced that the death was inevitable and that nothing mattered. The social order collapsed. Parents abandoned children. Husbands abandoned wives. The dead lay in the streets, unburied, rotting in the sun. The death toll is impossible to calculate precisely, but modern estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population. In some cities, the death rate was even higher. Florence lost perhaps half of its population. Venice lost 60%. Some villages simply disappeared. Their inhabitants dead or fled, their houses abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness. The plague didn't stop with Europe. It spread eastward as well, carrying by the same trade routes that had brought it west. From the Black Sea, it traveled back along the Silkroad to Persia and Central Asia, completing a circle of infection that encompassed the entire continent. From Persia, it spread to India, though the extent of the plague in India is unclear from the surviving records. From the Golden Horde, it spread to Russia, reaching Moscow by 1353. China, which had already been hit by the plague in 1330s, was hit again. The Yuan dynasty, already teetering, never recovered. The population declined. The economic disruption, the social chaos, all contributed to the dynasty's collapse. But the immediate crisis passed. By 1353, the worst was over. By 1353, the worst was over. The plague had burned through the population, killing everyone it could kill, leaving behind the survivors. Europe and Asia would never be the same. In 1368, a peasant's son named Xu Yueshang declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. He called it the Ming, meaning brilliant. His capital was at Nanjing on the Yangtze River, far from the foreign influences of the north. His mission, as he saw it, was to restore Chinese civilization after a century of Mongol rule. Zhou Yueshang, who took the reign name Hongkong, had risen from nothing. He was born into poverty, orphaned as a child, and forced to beg for food. He spent time in a Buddhist monastery, then joined the rebel army fighting the Mongols. He proved to be a brilliant military leader, uniting the various rebel factions under his command, driving the Mongols out of China. Once in power, Hongwu set about remaking China in his own image. He was suspicious of the wealthy, the educated, the powerful. He had grown among peasants, and he trusted peasants. He reduced taxes on agriculture, distributed land to the poor, and punished corrupt officials with brutal severity. He also centralized power in his own hands, eliminating the office of Prime Minister and ruling directly through a personal secretariat. Hongwu's vision for China was inward-looking. He had seen the damage done by the foreign rule, the disruption caused by foreign trade, the danger posed by foreign ideas. He wanted China to be self-sufficient, independent, pure. One of his first acts was to ban private maritime trade. Chinese merchants were forbidden to sail to foreign countries. Foreign merchants were restricted to specific ports and subjected to strict controls. The great trading fleets that had once sailed the South China Sea were laid up. Their captains forced into other occupations. Hongwu also turned against the Mongols and their culture. He forbade the wearing of Mongol clothing, the speaking of the Mongol language, the adoption of Mongol customs. He encouraged Chinese to marry Chinese, to preserve their purity, to remember their heritage. He rewrote history to portray the Mongols as barbarians and the Ming as saviors. improves the border crossings and strengthens the frontier defenses. The road that Shangqian had opened, that the Sultans had built, that the Mongols had protected, was slowly being abandoned. But Hongwu was not entirely consistent. He still needed horses for his cavalry, and the best horses still came from Central Asia. He still needed tribute from foreign rulers to validate his position as the son of heaven. He still needed intelligence about the Mongols, who had retreated to the steppe, but they remained a threat. So the Silk Road didn't close completely. A trickle of trade continued. Official missions carrying tribute and gifts. A few merchants with special permits. But the great caravans were gone. The bustling markets of the western regions, which had once been filled with Sogdian, Persian, and Indian merchants, were now quiet. The road was dying. Hongwu's successor, his son Yongo, would briefly reverse this policy. Yongo was a different kind of emperor. Ambitious, expansive, curious about the world. He moved the capital back to the north, to Beijing, closer to the Mongol threat and the Silk Road. He reopened trade relations with Central Asia, and he launched the greatest maritime expeditions the world had ever seen. But that is another story. In 1405, the first of 7 colossal fleets set sail from China. They were commanded by a man named Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who had served the emperor since childhood. His ships were the largest the world has ever seen. 9-masted junks, 400 feet long, carrying hundreds of men, loaded with silk and porcelain and gold. Their destinations were the port of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and Africa. Zheng He's voyages were the most ambitious maritime expeditions in history, decades before Columbus and centuries before the European age of exploration. They sailed to Java and Sumatra, to Ceylon and Calcutta, to Hormuz and Aden, to Mogadishu and Malindi. They brought back exotic animals, giraffes, zebras, ostriches. They brought back ambassadors from dozens of kingdoms, eager to pay tribute to the Ming Emperor. They brought back news of lands that no Chinese had ever seen. The purpose of the voyages is debated. historians see them as diplomatic missions designed to impress foreign rulers with the power and the wealth of China. Others see them as commercial ventures aimed at opening new markets for Chinese goods. Still others see them as strategic, intended to outflank the Mongol threat by building alliances with maritime powers. Whatever their purpose, the voyages were a brief flowering of Chinese maritime power. For 30 years, from 1405 to 1433, the Chinese fleets dominated the Indian Ocean. Chinese merchants and officials visited ports that had never seen a Chinese ship. Chinese goods flooded the markets of Asia and Africa. Chinese power was felt from the South China Sea to the coast of East Africa. Then it stopped. In 1433, the seventh voyage returned to China. The emperor, who had sponsored the voyages, I don't know if it's pronounced like that, died shortly afterward. His successor, the young Shentong, was under the influence of Confucian officials who had always opposed the expeditions. They argued that the voyages were too expensive, that they distracted from the real business of government, that they exposed China to dangerous foreign influences. The ships were laid up in the docks of Nanjing. The records of the voyages were destroyed or hidden. The shipbuilders and sailors were reassigned. China turned inward again, and this time it stayed like that. The maritime silkroad, which Shanghai had opened, was closed. The overland silkroad, already dying, continued its slow decline. China, the source of so much of the world's trade, had withdrawn from the world. By the middle of the 15th century, the Silk Road was a shadow of what it had been. The caravans still traveled, but they were smaller, less frequent, less profitable. The great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, still traded, but they traded regionally, not globally. The road that had connected the world was becoming a collection of local paths. The reasons were many. The plague had depopulated the cities and disrupted the trade networks. The lingered like an old man waiting for death, kept alive by local trade and regional politics. In the 16th century, it would have a brief revival under the Mughals in India and the Safavids in Persia. In the 17th century, it would carry Jesuit missionaries from Europe to China. In the 18th, it would carry tea and porcelain to Russia. It would never be what it had been, but it would never quite disappear. The shadows that had fallen on the road in the 14th century never entirely lifted. The plague had changed everything. It had killed millions, toppled the empires, transformed societies. It had shown, in the most brutal way possible, that the connections that made the Silk Road great also made it dangerous. The road that carried silk and spices could also carry death. And that lesson was not to be forgotten. This is the end of episode 5. For those who stayed until the end, thank you for listening to my content. I love you so much. We will see each other in the next video. Bye. Welcome, dear listener, in the last episode of my documentary for the Silk Road. So, without further ado, let's get started. Episode 6, New Seas, Old Roads. The old roads were dying, but the desire for silk and spices was not. When the overland routes became too dangerous, the merchants of Europe looked to the sea. This is the story of how the Silk Road ended and how it never really ended at all. In 1453, a young Ottoman Sultan named Mehmed II accomplished what his ancestors had attempted for centuries. He conquered Constantinople. The city had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years. It had withstood sieges by Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians. Its walls, built by Theodosius in the 5th century, were the strongest in the world. Its defenders, though few, were determined, but Mehmed had something his predecessors didn't have: cannons. A Hungarian engineer named Orban had offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor first. When the Emperor couldn't pay him off, Orban went to the Ottomans. He cast for Mehmed a cannon of unprecedented size, capable of firing a stone ball weighing 600 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it to position. When it fired, the sound could be heard for miles. For 55 days, walls of Constantinople. The defenders repaired the damage as best as they could, filling the breaches with the rubble and courage. But on the 56th day, a gate was left open. Ottoman soldiers poured in the city. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine IX, threw off his imperial regalia and died. Fighting in the streets. Mehmed rode into the city and went straight into the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Eastern Christianity. He ordered it converted into a mosque. Constantinople became Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman world, was no more of it. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. For centuries, the cities had been the gateway to the east, the place where European merchants bought the silks and spices that came overland from Asia. Now that gateway was closed. The Ottomans, hostile to the Christian Europe, controlled the Bosphorus Strait and the trade routes beyond. The price of the spices in European markets skyrocketed. Pepper, which had been expensive but affordable, became a luxury that only the richest could afford. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, all became scarce. European merchants, accustomed to the profits of the spice trade, looked for alternatives. They found two possibilities. One was to go around the Ottoman Empire to find a route to Asia that bypassed Muslim lands entirely. The other was to go by the sea. The Portuguese chose the sea. Prince Henry of Portugal wasn't a sailor. He never commanded a ship, never explored a coastline, never discovered a new land. But he earned his place in history as Henry the Navigator, the man who made the age of discovery possible. Henry was the third son of the King John I of Portugal. He had no expectation of inheriting the throne, so he devoted himself to other pursuits. He was fascinated by the stories of Africa that reached the Portuguese court. Tales of gold, of ivory, of a Christian kingdom ruled by a priest king called Prester John, somewhere in the interior. He was also motivated by religion. He wanted to convert the pagans of Africa, to spread the faith, to continue the crusade against Islam that had driven the Moors from Portugal centuries before. In 1419, Henry established himself at Sagres, on the southwest tip of Portugal, the closest point in compass, he studied the accounts of travelers who had ventured into the unknown, and he sent ships south along the coast of Africa. It was slow work. The sailors of the 15th century were terrified of the ocean beyond sight of land. They believed that the sea boiled at the equator, that monsters lurked in the depths, that the edge of the world waited just beyond the horizon. Henry's captains had to be bribed, cajoled, and threatened to go further than they had gone before. Year by year, they pushed south. In 1434, Gil Innes rounded Cape Bojador, a treacherous headland on the coast of western Africa that had marked the limit of the European navigation for centuries. Beyond it, he found not monsters, but open sea and a coastline that stretched endlessly south. The psychological barrier wasn't broken. In 1444, the first cargo of African slaves was brought back to Portugal. The slave trade, which would grow to monstrous proportions in the centuries to come, had begun. Henry celebrated the profits and sent more ships. By the time Henry died in 1460, Portuguese ships had reached Sierra Leone. They had established trading posts along the African coast. They had learned the winds and currents of the Atlantic. They had built a new kind of ship, a caravel, fast and maneuverable, capable of sailing into the wind. They were ready for the next step. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa. He called it the Cape of Storms. But King John II of Portugal, seeing the promise of a sea route to India, renamed it. But King John of Portugal, seeing the promise of a sea route to India, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The way to the Indian Ocean was open. In 1497, Vasco da Gama set out from Lisbon with 4 ships and 170 men. He rounded the Cape and sailed up the east coast of Africa, stopping at the trading cities of Mozambique and Mombasa. He hired a pilot who knew the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. In May 1498, he anchored off of the coast of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. When a local merchant asked what the Portuguese had come for, da Gama's men gave an answer that would echo through the centuries. Christians and spices. The sea route was open. While the Portuguese were working their way down the coast of Africa, an Italian sailor in the service of Spain had a different idea. Christopher Columbus was a Genoese sailor who had read Marco Polo's account of his travels. He believed that the Earth was smaller than most geographers thought, and that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. He proposed his plan to the kings of Portugal, England, and France, all of whom rejected it. Finally, in 1492, Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to sponsor him. On October 12th, 1492, Columbus sighted land. He believed that he had reached East Indies, the island off of the coast of Asia described by Marco Polo. He called the inhabitants Indians, a name that stuck. He returned to Spain with gold, parrots, and a few bewildered natives, convinced that he had found a western route to Asia. He was wrong, very wrong. He had found the Americas, a continent unknown to Europeans, a new world that would transform the global balance of power. But Columbus never accepted it. He died in 1506, still believing that he had reached Asia. The mistake was corrected by later explorers. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor in Spanish service, set out to find a way around the Americas. He sailed down to the coast of South America, found the strait that bears his name till today, and he crossed the Pacific. He reached the Philippines, where he was killed in a local war. One of his ships, the Victoria, continued west, crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and returned to Spain in 1522. The first circumnavigation of the world was complete. The implications were staggering. The world was round, and it was connected by ocean. The old overland routes, slow and dangerous, were no longer the only way to move goods between east and west. The sea offered a new path, cheaper and faster, capable of carrying bulk goods that could never have traveled by camel. The Portuguese moved quickly to exploit their advantage. They established trading posts at key points along the Indian Ocean. Goa on the west coast of India, Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, Hormuz at the entrance of the Persian Gulf, spice trade, using their superior ships and cannon to dominate the local rulers. They created the first global maritime empire. The Spanish, blocked from the Indian Ocean by the Portuguese, turned their attention to Americas. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, extracted vast quantities of gold and silver, and established a colonial system that would last for 3 centuries. The wealth of the Americas flowed into Europe, transforming its economy and its politics. The center of gravity of world trade shifted to the Mediterranean, which had been the heart of the European commerce. For millennia became a backwater. The Atlantic became the new center. The cities of Italy, which had grown rich on the overland trade, declined. The cities of Portugal and Spain, then of the Netherlands and England, they rose. The Silk Road, the overland network that had connected Asia for 2,000 years, was no longer the main artery of global commerce. It was a side road, a local path, a relic of a passing age. The Silk Road didn't disappear. It faded. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, trade continued along the old routes, but at a reduced level. The great caravans that had once crossed the continent became smaller, less frequent. The merchants who traveled them were regional traders, not the cosmopolitan figures of the earlier centuries. The cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, continued to function, but they were no longer the crossroads of the world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the road found new uses. The Russian Empire, expanding eastward across Siberia, established trading posts and military outposts along the old routes. Chinese merchants trading tea for furs with the Russians revived parts of the network. The great tea caravans that crossed Mongolia and Siberia in the 19th century were the last gasp of the old Silk Road. But the road was also being rediscovered in a different way. European explorers, archaeologists, and adventurers began traveling to Central Asia, seeking the lost cities and the forgotten civilizations of the Silk Road. They were drawn by the same thing that had drawn merchants for centuries: curiosity, ambition, and the desire for knowledge. The most famous of these explorers was a Hungarian-born British archaeologist named Oral Stein. In the early 20th century, Stein led 4 expeditions to Central Asia, exploring the ruins of the ancient silkroad cities in the Tarim Basin. He discovered the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas at Dunuang, a complex of Buddhist caves, temples filled with manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures. He removed thousands of items and shipped them back to London and Delhi, where they became the foundation of the Western scholarship on the Silk Road. Other explorers followed. The German Albert von Lecoq, the French Paul Belliot, the Japanese Otani Kazui, all competed to find the greatest treasures, to make the most important discoveries, to bring back the richest artifacts. The Silk Road, which had once carried goods and ideas, now carried scholars and archaeologists. Stein also discovered something else: the letters of Nai van Dyck, a Sogdian merchant whose correspondence from the 4th century had been buried in a watchtower near Dunuang. Those letters, forgotten for 16 centuries, gave historians a glimpse into the daily life of the Silk Road, the risk and rewards of long-distance trade, the networks of trust and obligation that held the system together. The Silk Road was being reconstructed piece by piece from the fragments that had survived. The road that had connected the world was being reconnected by scholarships. In the 21st century, the Silk Road is being reborn. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, is the most ambitious infrastructure project in history. It aims to rebuild the ancient trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe by land and by sea. New roads, railways, pipelines, and ports are being built across the continent. The old Silk Road is becoming new again. Trains now run from Chongqing in central China to Duisburg in Germany, carrying laptops and auto parts, completing the journey in 16 days, a fraction of the time it took the old caravans. Pipelines carry oil and gas from Central Asia to China's hungry industries. Ports along the Indian Ocean are being expanded and modernized, reviving the maritime routes that Zheng He sailed 6 centuries ago. Critics see that the Belt and Road Initiative as a tool of Chinese influence, a way to bind other countries to Chinese interests. Supporters see it as a development project, a way to lift poor regions out of poverty. Whatever its motivations, it represents a return to the old patterns of exchange, a recognition that the connections Shangqian first mapped 2,000 years ago are still relevant. The Silk Road never really ended. It changed, adapted, transformed. It survived the fall of empires, the spread of plague, the rise of new technologies. It survived because the desire for exchange, for goods, for ideas, for connection is fundamental to human nature. People will always seek what they do not have, will always travel to find it, will always build roads to bring it home. Shangqian, the Sogdian merchants, the Buddhist monks, the Mongol warriors, the European explorers, all of them were part of this story. All of them walked the same roads, faced the same dangers, sought the same connections. All of them contributed to the great network of exchange that shaped our world. The road is still there. The threads remain, and the story continues. This is the end of episode 6. For those who stayed until the end, thank you for listening to my content. It is really important for me, the thing that I do, and I hope that it's gonna become something big. Thank you again, and see you in the next video. Bye. This has been the story of the Silk Road, a story